personality, we have to gather evidence to prove that the word we chose actually does describe the character. And that's what we're going to be working on doing today. We're going to look for the words, thoughts, and actions of the characters to see if they prove the character trait that we choose for the character. So just like we said, like I said, the guy in Despicable Me might fit evil because he does evil things. He tries to steal the moon, he steals the pyramid, so he's kind of an evil guy. We're going to read a story today called The Lottery, and we're going to look for words and actions that describe the character of that help us describe the character traits of Mrs. Hutchinson. So we're going to be reading the first part of this story today, and we're going to be looking for things that Mrs. Hutchinson says and things that she does that help us to describe her personality. So when you finish your notes, you should have this on your desk. Take a look at it, put your name on it. Yes?
When we read
I'm going to give you something specific to do while we're reading. Here, just another minute to finish their notes. And it's a track this paper. Amani's just about done. She has a date card paper, very nice. Brendan's got his notes finished, and he's glancing at the story. Zamir is glancing at the story and thinking through his name on it, like I asked. Today's the 16th. I'm sorry, you can't see it. So we're going to read the story, the beginning of it, called The Lottery. And we're looking for words, thoughts, and actions that help us come up with a character trait from Mrs. Hutchinson. But it is a pretty interesting story. So I want to make sure that you have some markings to use just in case you have a thought that doesn't pertain to the character traits that we're talking about today. So if you're confused about something, or if you think something's really interesting, or if you have a question about something, or you think something's important, you can go ahead and use these markings on your text to make note of where that was, so we can come back and talk about it later. Because while we're reading, I want to focus our attention on Mrs. Hutchinson. But there's a lot of good stuff in this story, so I want to make sure that we have these in mind to come back to in case we need them. So which character are we focusing our attention on as we read? Let's make sure we're clear. There's somebody give me an answer hand. Which character? Brendan. Mrs. Hutchinson. We won't meet her for the first page or so. And what are we looking for about Mrs. Hutchinson as we read? Alonzo?
Words, thoughts, and actions.
Words, thoughts, and actions. So as you come across any words, thoughts, and actions about Mrs. Hutchinson, I want you to underline them in the text or circle them with your paper. Or if you have a highlighter, you're welcome to highlight as well.
Oh.
So we're going to read out loud. If you come across, as I'm reading, if you notice anything about Mrs. Hutchinson, I want you to underline or circle it on your paper. That means your eyes are going to be following along on your story. You have your story? All right, I'm going to get started. The morning of June 27th was clear and sunny. With the fresh warmth of a full summer day, like that Nicholas says in the paper, beyond tracking with a pen, the flowers were blossoming profusely and the grass was richly green. The people of the village began to gather in the square between the post office and the bank around 10 o'clock. In some towns, there were so many people that the lottery took 2 days and had to be started on June 26th. But in this village, there were only about 300 people. The whole lottery took less than 2 hours, so it could begin at 10 o'clock in the morning. I'm giving additions to scholars that I see tracking with their paper. Nice job. And still be through in time to allow the villagers to get home in time for noon dinner. The children assembled first, of course. School was recently over for the summer, and the feeling of liberty sat uneasily on most of them. They tended to gather together quietly for a while before they broke into boisterous play. What kind of play would that be? If it's boisterous play, that's a vocab word from yesterday, so I should see lots of hands up. What kind of play would that be? Oh, I should see lots. I want to see at least 7 hands up before, because that was a vocab word from yesterday. What kind of play would be boisterous play? I like that I see Charles looking back in the notes. I mean, what kind of play is that going to be? Noisy and energetic play. So the kids are playing around, they're being kind of boisterous. That's what we expect kids to do, right? Next. And their talk, thanks Brendan, was still of the classroom and the teacher, of books and reprimands. Bobby Martin had already stuffed his pockets full of stones, and the other boys soon followed his example, selecting the smoothest and roundest stones. Bobby and Mary Jones and Dickie Delacroix, the villagers pronounced the name Delacroix, eventually made a great pile of stones in one corner of the square and guarded it against the raids of the other boys. Those stones are going to be important later on, so make sure you're taking note of that. The stones are going to be really important later on in the story. Even though they don't necessarily help us know anything about Mrs. Hutchinson, they're going to be super important. If you just came in, thanks for getting right to your seat, taking a look at the story. We're just at the second column right here. we're not going to finish both stories yet. The girls stood aside, talking among themselves, looking over their shoulders at the boys, and the very small children rolled in the dust or clung to the hands of their oldest brothers and sisters. Soon the men began to gather, surveying their own children, speaking of planting and rain, tractors and taxes. They stood together away from the pile of stones in the corner. And their jokes were quiet and they smiled rather than laughed right there. The women wearing faded house dresses and sweaters came shortly after their menfolk. Love the tracking parade. They greeted one another and exchanged bits of gossip as they went to join their husbands. Soon the women standing by their husbands began to call their children, and the children came reluctantly, having to be called 4 or 5 times. Yep, Brennan?
Reluctantly.
That was one of our words that word. I love that you noticed that.
It means.
Anyone know what does reluctantly mean? Since we've noticed one of our vocab words is in there. I like the ones going back in the notes, that's what they're for. Rick, can you help us out? Not willing to do something. So the kids don't really want to come to their parents. I like that I do things for silent signals. Remember that we're silent while we're reading. Bobby Martin ducked under his mother's grasping hand and ran, laughing, back to the pile of stones. His father spoke up sharply, and Bobby came quickly and took his place between his father and his oldest brother. The lottery was conducted, as were the square dances, the teenage club, the Halloween program, by Mr. Summers, who had time and energy to devote to civic activities. He was a round-faced, jovial man, and he ran the coal business, and people were sorry for him because he had no children and his wife was a scold. When he arrived in the square carrying the black wooden box, there was a murmur of conversation among the villagers, and he waved and called, "A little late today, folks." The postmaster, Mr. Graves, followed him, carrying a 3-legged stool, and the stool was put in the center of the square, and Mr. Summers put the black box down on it. The villagers kept their distance, leaving a space between themselves and the stool. Mr. Summers said, "Some of you fellows want to give a hand?" There was a hesitation before 2 men, Mr. Martin